Chapter 1. The Quiet Diner. The rain poured relentlessly, streaking the windows of a small, worn-down diner on the edge of a quiet town. The neon sign flickered weakly above the entrance, casting a dull glow on the wet pavement outside. The small bell above the door jingled each time the wind pushed it open, but inside, the atmosphere was warm and inviting. The quiet hum of a blues song from an old jukebox filled the space, creating a sense of calm that clashed with the storm brewing outside. It was the kind of diner where the coffee was always fresh, the food reliably good, and the staff always knew your name if you came in enough times. Tonight, though, the usual comfort seemed to be absent. The storm had driven away all but a few of the regulars. A couple of truckers sat at a corner booth, their heads buried in newspapers, only occasionally glancing up when the door chimed. An elderly man, whose gray beard hung down past his chin, sipped from a chipped mug by the window. The smell of grilled burgers, bacon, and fresh coffee filled the air, but it wasn't enough to distract from the growing unease that seemed to hang in the air. Behind the counter, a young woman moved with practiced efficiency. Her name was Jessica Lee, and despite the exhaustion etched in her features, there was a quiet strength about her. Her dark hair, pulled back into a ponytail, framed a face that was both tired and determined. She wiped down the counter, her movements quick and precise, but every now and then, her eyes would flick to the door as if anticipating something or someone that could disrupt the fragile peace. As she turned to grab another coffee cup, she caught sight of him, the man who just walked in. The door swung open with a sudden rush of wind, and the bell above jingled noisily as the man entered. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and his presence seemed to fill the room in an instant. Chris Hemsworth, dressed casually in a simple jacket and jeans, stood for a moment just inside the doorway, shaking the rain off his coat. His gaze swept the diner, scanning the room with an air of practiced nonchalance. He didn't look for trouble, but the ease with which he moved through the world suggested he could handle it if it came knocking. Jessica glanced up from behind the counter, catching his eyes for a fleeting moment before quickly averting her gaze. She had seen plenty of people come through the door, but there was something different about him. Maybe it was the way he carried himself, or maybe it was just the sense that, somehow, this evening wouldn't be like the others. Her stomach twisted slightly, though she wasn't sure if it was the cold breeze or something else that made her uneasy. "Good evening, sir," Jessica said, forcing a smile as she moved to greet him, her voice steady. "What can I get for you tonight?" Chris returned her smile, his deep voice warm and calming, the kind of voice that could make anyone feel at ease, even if just for a moment. "A double burger, fries, and a coffee," he said, his tone low and easygoing. "I'm just passing through, thought I'd grab a bite." Jessica nodded, writing the order down in her notepad, though she felt an odd sense of relief. There was something about his calm demeanor that made her feel like maybe, just maybe, tonight wouldn't be like the others. She turned and moved to the kitchen, but the tension she'd felt earlier didn't leave her. She could feel it in the air, hanging like a storm cloud on the verge of bursting. She caught sight of his reflection in the diner's window as she passed the counter, and the way he was watching her, quietly observing, but not in an intrusive way, made her pause. He wasn't here just for a meal. She could sense it, though she couldn't quite place why. Her steps quickened as she reached the kitchen, trying to shake off the feeling that something was about to happen. But when she returned to the front of the diner, it was already clear that something had shifted. The air was thicker now, the quiet that had settled before replaced with an unsettling energy. The door slammed open again. The bell above the entrance rang violently, and Jessica's heart skipped a beat. 5 men strolled in, their presence alone making the room feel smaller. They wore leather jackets with faded patches, their heavy boots making a distinct thud against the old wooden floor. The smell of motor oil and stale cigarette smoke wafted behind them, and Jessica's grip tightened on the counter. She knew who they were. She had seen them come through the door before. Jake Turner and his gang. Jake, the leader, was a burly man in his mid-40s with a deep scar running down his cheek, his face as weathered as the leather jacket he wore. He moved with the self-assured arrogance of someone who had spent his life intimidating others. As soon as he walked in, he glanced around the diner, his eyes lingering on Jessica, and his lips curled into a sly grin. Well, Jake said, his voice rough as gravel. He stepped forward, leaning his hands heavily on the counter, almost knocking over a cup of coffee in the process. If it ain't our favorite waitress. Thought you'd be gone by now, girl. Jessica froze, the words a cold reminder of past encounters. She had been here before, too many times before, and she wasn't sure how much longer she could keep her head down and pretend this wasn't happening. I'm not giving you anything, Jake, Jessica said, her voice steady despite the flutter of nerves in her chest. This diner's not for your extortion. Jake's smirk widened. He reached forward, swiping a sugar packet off the counter, rolling it between his fingers as if weighing his options. See, that's where you're wrong, he said, his voice laced with contempt. This diner's in our territory now, and if you want to keep running it, you'll pay up. Simple as that. Jessica's jaw clenched. She knew this was coming. She had known it for months. The intimidation, the threats, the feeling of being powerless. But tonight, something felt different. Maybe it was the way her fingers curled tightly around the counter, or the way her chest seemed to tighten as she fought the urge to back down. I told you before, Jake, Jessica said, her voice firmer now, a trace of defiance slipping through the cracks. This place isn't yours, and I'm not giving in. Jake chuckled, shaking his head as though she were nothing more than a child playing at something far beyond her ability to understand. You don't get it, do you? You'll pay. Eventually. One of the other bikers, a lanky guy with a crooked grin and a chipped tooth, laughed lowly. Oh yeah, you always do. Don't act like you've got a choice, sweetheart. Jessica's knuckles whitened, but she didn't back down. This wasn't just about money. It was about respect. And tonight, she wasn't going to let him take that from her. Before Jake could say anything more, the door creaked open again. But this time, it wasn't just another customer. It was someone who would change everything. Chris Hemsworth, the quiet observer, stood up from his booth, his expression no longer neutral but alert. He had been watching this unfold, sensing the danger before it became too obvious. And just like that, the diner held its breath. Something was about to break. Chapter 2. The Biker Gang. The moment the door swung open, the diner's atmosphere shifted from quiet uncertainty to a thick, suffocating tension. The biker's boots clacked loudly against the wooden floor, a stark contrast to the steady, muted hum of the old jukebox. Jake Turner led the group with a swagger that made it clear he wasn't here to eat. He was here to make a statement. The other patrons, who had been murmuring quietly amongst themselves just moments ago, now fell into uneasy silence. It wasn't unusual for bikers to stop by on their way through town, but these men weren't just passing through. They were taking control. Jake scanned the room with a predator's gaze, eyes narrowing as they fell on Jessica, who was still standing behind counter. He smirked and swaggered over toward her, the clink of his heavy belt buckle punctuating every step. His crew flanked him, each man casting a wary eye around the room, their body language tense and expectant. Well, what do we have here? Jake drawled, leaning on the counter. His voice was low and rough, but it carried the weight of someone used to getting what they wanted. Still here, huh? Thought for sure you'd have learned your lesson by now. Jessica kept her gaze fixed on the counter, but inside, her heart was hammering. She could feel the eyes of the other bikers boring into her, the pressure mounting. She had seen this before. Months of intimidation, of feeling trapped in her own skin, but something inside her had shifted. Maybe it was the strange calm she had felt when Chris Hemsworth walked in, or maybe it was the quiet resolve she was finally building in herself. But tonight was different. She wasn't going to let them push her around anymore. I'm not giving you a dime, Jake, she said firmly, keeping her voice steady. This place is still standing, and you're not going to change that. Jake's grin deepened, and he slowly stood up, straightening to his full height. He had heard her defiance before, but this time it seemed different. She wasn't as scared, and that irritated him more than anything else. See, that's where you're wrong, sweetheart. This diner's in our territory. We own this place, and you know it. You either pay up, or things are going to get ugly. Jessica's eyes flicked to Chris Hemsworth for a moment. He was still sitting in the corner booth, his expression unreadable, but she could sense he was aware of the rising tension. She didn't want to involve him. This wasn't his fight, but something about his presence made her feel like maybe, just maybe, she wasn't alone in this anymore. Jake leaned in closer, his breath heavy with whiskey and cigarettes. "It's not personal, darling. It's just business. You can't run this place without us. You can't stand up to us. You'll see that soon enough." He reached across the counter and snatched up a sugar packet, tossing it from one hand to the other like he was casually deciding her fate. One of the bikers, a tall, lanky man with a chipped tooth, stepped forward, cracking his knuckles with an exaggerated motion. "Yeah, you'll pay all right. Don't act like you got a choice." Jessica's grip on the counter tightened, but she didn't flinch. This time, she wasn't going to be intimidated. The words came out with a firmness that surprised even her. "This diner is not for your extortion, Jake. I told you before, I'm not paying for protection, and I never will." The air in the diner felt heavy with the weight of Jake's gaze. The other bikers stood still, watching, waiting for a reaction. The old men in the corner booths pretended not to notice, but they were all too aware of what was happening. No one had ever stood up to Jake Turner before, not like this. Jake's hand shot out, slapping the counter with a force that made the salt shaker rattle. "You've got a real attitude, girl," he sneered. "That's what gets people in trouble." One of his crew, a wiry guy with a neck tattoo, snickered, crossing his arms. "She's got fire, all right. Too bad it won't save her." Jessica bit her lip. They could insult her, they could threaten her, but they couldn't take away her pride. She met Jake's eyes, unflinching. "I told you, Jake, it's not happening. This diner is mine, and I'm not letting you take it." There was a brief pause, a silence that seemed to stretch on forever. Jake tilted his head, eyeing Jessica as if weighing whether or not to escalate things further. Then he stepped back with a slow, deliberate motion, his hands resting on his hips. "You really think you can handle this on your own?" His voice was tinged with mocking amusement. "You really think you can push us around? You know what happens to people who don't know their place, right?" Jessica's stomach churned, but she refused to back down. "I'm not afraid of you." Jake barked a laugh, turning his attention to the rest of his gang. "You hear that? She's not afraid of us, boys. Guess we'll just have to teach her a little lesson." His men chuckled, clearly enjoying the tension, their laughter a rough sound that echoed in the small diner. But Jessica didn't budge. The fear that had once ruled her every moment was beginning to melt away, replaced with something stronger, a sense of determination. But it wasn't just her resolve that was about to change everything. From the corner of the room, Chris Hemsworth stood up slowly, his movements fluid and deliberate. His presence, calm yet unshakable, seemed to fill the room as he walked toward the counter. The bikers noticed him, but they didn't fully recognize the danger he presented. Not yet. Jessica saw the shift in Jake's expression as he turned to face Chris. There was something about the man's posture, something about the quiet intensity that made Jake pause for a fraction of a second. The tension in the room grew heavier, and for the first time that night, Jake seemed uncertain. Well, Jake said, sizing Chris up. "Looks like we've got ourselves a celebrity in the house. What do you want, pretty boy?" Chris didn't respond immediately. He simply took a step closer, his eyes never leaving Jake's, a steady confidence radiating from him. The sound of the jukebox in the corner seemed to fade as the room fell into an eerie silence. "I'm not here to fight," Chris said, his voice low, almost too calm. "But if you're looking for one, you've got the wrong guy." Jake chuckled darkly. "You think your muscles are going to intimidate me? This isn't the ring, buddy. You're out of your league." Chris didn't flinch. He simply stepped forward, his calm gaze never wavering. And just like that, the atmosphere changed again. It wasn't just Jessica standing up to them anymore. It was Chris Hemsworth, a man who had seen his share of battles, standing between her and the gang, ready to stop them before they could hurt anyone else. Chapter 3. The Fight Begins. The atmosphere in the diner had shifted, a palpable tension filling the room. The clattering of dishes and the soft hum of the jukebox had been replaced by the sharp, heavy silence that followed Chris Hemsworth's entrance. The bikers, still standing in a loose circle around the counter, eyed him with growing unease. Jake Turner, who had once been the source of all the fear and intimidation in the room, now seemed a little less certain of himself. Chris took another step forward, his broad shoulders square, his expression calm but unwavering. His deep voice broke the silence. "You've had your fun, now leave." Jake's lips curled into a smirk, his blue eyes narrowing as he sized up the newcomer. The gang's laughter, which had previously filled the room with menace, had faltered just slightly. There was something about Chris that made them hesitate, a quiet strength, a certain calm that only made him more dangerous. "You think you could just walk in here and tell me what to do?" Jake growled, his voice thick with disdain. "This is our territory, man. We run things here. You're out of your league." Chris didn't flinch, his eyes still locked on Jake's. "I'm not looking to run anything," he said calmly, "but I don't take kindly to bullies." Jake's smirk deepened, but the unease was clear. He turned to his men, giving them a subtle nod. "Looks like we got a tough guy on our hands, boys," he said, stepping back a little. His tone was still dismissive, but now there was a flicker of doubt in his eyes. "Let's show him what happens when you mess with us." The bikers started to close in, the clink of their boots on the wooden floor sounding like the ticking of a clock, each step bringing them closer to the fight that was about to erupt. One of Jake's men, a lanky guy with a crooked smile and a chipped tooth, cracked his knuckles loudly. He was eager for a fight, the kind of man who thrived on chaos. Another biker, with a snake tattoo curling around his neck, moved toward Chris, his fingers twitching at his belt as though preparing for something. Chris didn't back away. He stood his ground, his eyes sweeping over the gang, measuring each man as they advanced. His jaw clenched slightly, the muscles in his arms flexing subtly as he prepared for what was coming. Without warning, the first biker lunged forward. The lanky man with the chipped tooth swung a heavy right hook at Chris's jaw, his movement fast and aggressive, the punch aimed to knock him off his feet. Chris reacted instantly, sidestepping with the fluidity of a man who had been in more than his share of physical confrontations. The punch grazed his cheek, but Chris was already on the move, stepping into the biker's space. In one smooth motion, he slammed his shoulder into the man's midsection, lifting him off his feet and sending him crashing into a nearby table with a loud crash. The force of the impact splintered the wooden table, sending plates and silverware scattering across the floor. The diner erupted into chaos, the few patrons who had been silently observing now scrambling to the sides, ducking behind booze or clutching their drinks in fear. The lanky biker groaned, tried to push himself up, but Chris wasn't done. He grabbed the man by the collar and tossed him aside like a rag doll, sending him crashing into a booth with a thud. The noise echoed through the diner, but it was drowned out by the growl of the second biker, who was already charging at Chris from behind. This one, a wiry man with the tattoo winding up his neck, lunged with surprising speed, his arm wrapping around Chris's throat in an attempt to choke him. But Chris had seen this move before. With a swift motion, he grabbed the biker's wrist, twisting it sharply, forcing the man to release his grip. The biker let out a pained scream as Chris continued to move, using the momentum to slam him into the floor in a modified belly-to-belly suplex. The floorboard shook with the impact, and the man groaned, his body limp from the shock. At this point, the third biker, a bulky man with a thick black beard, decided it was time to escalate the situation. He grabbed a chair, lifting it over his head and aiming to smash it against Chris's back. The chair cracked against Chris's back with a deafening snap, but he barely flinched. His muscles rippled with the impact, but his expression remained unchanged. In the same fluid motion, Chris turned to face the third biker, his fist launching forward with brutal precision. A devastating elbow collided with the man's face, sending him reeling backward. The biker stumbled into a nearby booth, his legs giving out as he crumpled to the floor, groaning in pain. The diner was a complete mess now. Overturned tables, broken chairs, and shattered dishes scattered across the floor. The clatter of the fight was the only sound, but there was something deeper beneath it, a silence filled with shock. Even the bikers seemed to hesitate now. Their leader, Jake, stood a few feet back, his eyes flicking between his fallen men and Chris Hemsworth, who had barely broken a sweat. The remaining bikers looked at each other, uncertainty flickering in their eyes. They had never encountered anyone like Chris before, someone who seemed impervious to fear, someone who didn't back down. And now, with three of their own on the floor, they were beginning to realize that their numbers weren't as advantageous as they had thought. Jake, however, wasn't one to back down easily. He cracked his knuckles, his jaw tight with frustration. "All right, boys. Looks like we've got a real problem here," he muttered. "Let's teach this guy a lesson he won't forget." The tension in the air was thick, suffocating. The remaining bikers spread out, forming a loose circle around Chris Hemsworth, their eyes filled with a dangerous mix of anger and fear. They were trying to regain control, to intimidate him into submission. But Chris, unfazed, stood in the center, his muscles coiled and ready for the next wave of attacks. The rest of the diners sat frozen, their eyes wide with a mix of awe and disbelief. No one had ever seen anything like this before. The men who had once ruled this town with their threats and their fear were being torn apart by a man who wasn't afraid to stand up to them. Jake hesitated for a moment, his eyes narrowing as he assessed the situation. He hadn't planned for things to go this way, but he was the leader, and his pride wouldn't let him back down. His gaze hardened, and he nodded to his remaining men. "Let's finish this," he growled. Chapter 4: The Aftermath. The diner was eerily quiet now. The violent clash had left its mark, with overturned tables, shattered glass, and broken chairs scattered across the floor. The once cozy, welcoming space was now unrecognizable, a scene of chaos and destruction. But in the midst of it all, Chris Hemsworth stood as still as a mountain, his breath steady as he surveyed the wreckage. The bikers, once so sure of themselves, now lay sprawled across the floor, groaning in pain, unable to move. The lanky biker with the chipped tooth was the first to stir, his hand reaching weakly for his shoulder where Chris had slammed him into the table. He groaned in frustration as he tried to get to his feet, but the pain was too much. The wiry man with the neck tattoo lay, face down, breathing heavily, his body bent awkwardly from the force of the suplex. The bearded biker, who had tried to smash the chair over Chris's back, was nursing his face, which was now bruised and swollen from the elbow strike. Only Jake Turner, the leader, was still attempting to pull himself together. He lay on his back, struggling to roll over, but every movement was slow and pained. His face, usually so full of arrogance, was now twisted with disbelief, his once smug expression replaced with something more vulnerable, a look that matched the rest of his crew. As the heavy silence stretched on, the sound of sirens in the distance began to fill the air. The flashing lights outside painted the diner's window with an eerie glow, signaling the arrival of the police. But before they could enter, Jessica Lee was already moving behind the counter, her movements shaky but determined. She hadn't taken her eyes off the bikers since the fight ended, her expression a mixture of exhaustion and triumph. Her hands trembled slightly as she wiped the counter, trying to clear away the remnants of the chaos. The diner's floor was littered with debris, and there was a distinct smell of spilled coffee and burnt food in the air. But none of that mattered right now. For the first time in months, Jessica felt something she hadn't felt in a long time: power. She caught Chris's gaze as he stood near the counter, his body relaxed but ready. His presence had changed everything, given her the strength to stand up when she had once thought it impossible. For all his calm, Chris seemed to be watching her more than he was paying attention to the bikers on the floor. His steady gaze was reassuring, and Jessica realized she didn't feel afraid anymore. She cleared her throat, trying to keep her composure. "Thank you," she said, her voice soft but sincere. "I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't stepped in." Chris gave a slight nod, his expression neutral, but there was a glimmer of approval in his eyes. "No one should have to live in fear," he said simply, his voice deep and steady. "You did the right thing by standing your ground. They were always going to try to push you around, but you don't have to let them." Jessica swallowed, her throat tight. "I've been scared for so long," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "But tonight something just clicked. Maybe I've been letting them have too much power. I can't keep letting them control me." Chris smiled faintly, his eyes softening. You're stronger than you realize." Before Jessica could respond, the door swung open again, this time with the sharp clatter of police officers entering the diner. Two officers, their dark uniforms stark against the brightly lit interior, stepped inside, scanning the room for signs of trouble. One of them, a tall, broad-shouldered man with graying hair, took a step forward. His name, Tag, read Sergeant Michaels, and he had the weary look of someone who had seen too much in his career. Well, Sergeant Michaels muttered, his gaze flicking over the bikers on the floor. "If it isn't Jake Turner and his crew again." His tone was dry, unamused, as though he were used to seeing the same faces in this kind of situation. He took a moment to assess the damage, his eyes narrowing at the overturned booths and the wreckage around the diner. "You guys never learn, do you?" Jake groaned from where he lay, his body racked with pain, but his pride still intact. "This isn't over, Michaels," he spat, though his voice was weak. "You don't know what you're messing with." Sergeant Michaels didn't even flinch. "Oh, I know exactly what I'm dealing with," he said with a sigh. "And frankly, Jake, I'm tired of seeing your face in here. Looks like your little extortion racket isn't going to be working anymore." The second officer, a younger man with a sharp jawline, pulled out a notepad and started scribbling down notes. "You the one who called it in?" he asked, turning toward Jessica. His gaze softened when he saw her standing behind the counter, her hand still trembling. Jessica nodded, taking a deep breath. "Yeah, that was me," she replied, her voice steadier now. "They've been threatening me for months. I couldn't take it anymore. I had to call it in." Sergeant Michaels gave her a tired but appreciative look. "You did the right thing. We've been after these guys for a while, but no one's ever been brave enough to come forward. Guess it took someone like him to make it stick," he said, jerking his head toward Chris. Chris raised an eyebrow, but didn't speak. He wasn't here for the recognition. He had done what he felt was right, and that was enough. One of the other bikers, the one with the broken nose, tried to sit up, groaning in pain. "This isn't right. We were just minding our own business until that guy." He gestured weakly toward Chris, but before he could continue, Sergeant Michaels interrupted with a raised hand. "I'm not interested in your excuses," he said flatly. "The cameras don't lie. We got a witness who recorded the whole thing on his phone. You're all done." He turned to his partner. "Call in. We're taking them in for extortion, assault, and destruction of property." The younger officer nodded, pulling out his radio to make the call. Meanwhile, the other patrons who had been hiding during the commotion were slowly starting to emerge from their booths, their expressions a mix of disbelief and admiration. One older man with a grizzled face crossed his arms over his chest and let out a low whistle. "Hell of a thing you did there, son," he said, his voice gruff but approving. "Never thought I'd see the day someone took those bastards down." Jessica turned to look at him, her brow furrowed. They've been running this town like it's theirs for years. No one ever stood up to them before. Chris met her gaze, his eyes steady. "That's the problem," he said simply. "People like that count on the fear. But once you stand up, it all changes." The officers moved swiftly, cuffing the bikers one by one and dragging them toward the door. Jake Turner struggled briefly, but it was clear he didn't have the strength to resist anymore. As they were escorted out, one of the officers glanced at Chris Hemsworth, a slight smirk tugging at his lips. "You know," the officer said, "we don't usually get guys like you getting involved in things like this. But hell, we could use more people like you around." Chris shrugged, a small grin on his face. "I just didn't like the way things were going. Somebody had to do something." Jessica couldn't help but smile a little as the officers left, taking the last of the bikers out of the diner. The sirens wailed in the distance as the flashing red and blue lights faded into the night. The calm that followed was surreal, almost too peaceful after everything that had just happened. Sergeant Michaels turned back to Jessica before he left. "You sure you want to press charges? I'll make sure they don't get off easy this time." Jessica hesitated for a moment, looking around at the wreckage, the pieces of her old life still scattered around the diner. Then she met Chris's eyes, his steady gaze making her feel stronger. "Yeah," she said, her voice firm. "I'm pressing charges. This ends tonight." Sergeant Michaels nodded, satisfied. "Good. We'll take it from here." As the door swung shut behind the officers, A deep breath seemed to fill the diner. The worst was over, but the weight of what had happened still lingered. The bikers were gone, but their impact was still felt. Yet, as Jessica stood there, cleaning up the wreckage and finally taking control, she couldn't shake the feeling that things had changed forever. Chris leaned back against the counter, his coffee cup still untouched. "You okay?" he asked, his voice softer now. Jessica paused for a moment, looking around the wrecked diner, then met his gaze. "I think so," she said, "but it's going to take a while to get things back to normal." Chris gave a small nod. "Yeah, but it's a start." Chapter 5. Moving forward. The diner was quiet now, its usual hum replaced by a stillness that seemed to linger after the chaos had passed. The police cruisers had long since left, their sirens cutting through the night and fading into the distance. The wreckage was still all around, shattered plates, spilled coffee, broken chairs scattered across the floor. But even as Jessica slowly began to gather the broken pieces, there was something different about the air now. Something had shifted in her, something she hadn't expected, but was undeniably there. Chris Hemsworth was still seated at his booth, his meal forgotten for the moment. He watched her work quietly, his eyes following her every movement with a calm intensity. He wasn't the kind of man who needed constant validation or praise. He had done what he felt was right, and now, as the dust settled, he seemed content to let Jessica take the lead. "Don't worry about it," Chris called softly, his voice breaking through the silence. "You don't have to clean up all of this by yourself." Jessica paused mid-sweep, looking up at him. Her eyes were tired, but there was a spark of something new in them, a glimmer of determination that hadn't been there before. She let out a breath, tried to push the last remnants of adrenaline from her system. "Someone's got to do it, right?" She gave him a tired smile, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "Besides, it's not like I can just leave this mess for someone else." Chris tilted his head slightly, watching her with an unreadable expression. He knew what this was about. She wasn't just cleaning the diner. She was reclaiming something that had been taken from her. For months, perhaps even years, she had been the victim of fear, intimidation, and control. But now, she was standing up, not just to Jake Turner and his gang, but to the whole weight of that fear that had once defined her. "You don't have to be afraid of them anymore," Chris said, his tone steady, like he was trying to remind her of something she had forgotten. "What you did tonight, that was bravery. And it's not just about the bikers. It's about everything." Jessica swallowed, wiping her brow with the back of her hand. She had been afraid for so long, afraid to stand up, afraid to be noticed. But now, with the remnants of the fight scattered around her, she realized that maybe the fear wasn't as strong as it had once been. Before she could respond, the door jingled again. It was soft at first, just a hint of movement that made Jessica glance up. But this time, it wasn't the bikers coming back for revenge, and it wasn't the police either. A few of the patrons who had been hiding during the fight began to emerge. The older trucker from earlier was the first to step forward, his worn boots clinking against the floor as he made his way toward the counter. He looked at Jessica, his gaze filled with something close to respect, even admiration. "That was some hell of a thing you did there, girl," he said, his voice rough with age and experience. "Never thought I'd see anyone take down Jake Turner and his boys like that. Hell, I didn't think anyone had the guts to stand up to him." Jessica met his gaze and smiled, though it was a little shaky. "Thanks. It wasn't easy, but I couldn't just keep letting them push me around." The trucker nodded, his face softening slightly. "You got more guts than most folks I know," he said. "Those boys, they've been running this town for too long. No one's ever stood up to M like that before." Jessica glanced toward Chris Hemsworth, who was watching the exchange with quiet approval. "I couldn't have done it without a little help," she said, nodding toward him. "I couldn't have done it at all if he hadn't stepped in." The trucker's eyes followed her gaze, a small grin tugging at his lips. "Hell, I figured that guy was more of a TV star than a troublemaker," he muttered. "But I'll tell you, that was something else. You sure don't see a guy like him talk keen on a whole gang of bikers in a diner." Chris shrugged, giving the trucker a quick smile. "I just don't like seeing people get bullied. Sometimes you have to make a stand." Jessica couldn't help but feel a small sense of pride, despite the mess still surrounding her. This was her fight. She had taken a stand, with Chris's help, but it was her bravery that had made the difference. She wasn't the same person she had been before, and though there was still fear lingering in the back of her mind, it didn't have the same hold on her. As more patrons emerged from their booths, a few of them offering their congratulations or just nodding in her direction, the energy in the diner began to shift. There was a quiet sense of community now, a bond forged not just in the chaos of the fight, but in the collective recognition that things had changed. For once, people were standing together, not out of fear, but because they realized that they no longer had to cower before the likes of Jake Turner. Think they'll come back? One of the customers, a middle-aged woman clutching her purse tightly, asked quietly, glancing nervously toward the door. Jessica hesitated. The words Jake had left her with still echoed in her mind. You think this is over? I got people, and they don't like it when one of their own gets locked up. But the thought didn't scare her anymore. She had already taken the first step, and if they did come back, she wouldn't be alone. I don't know, Jessica said finally, her voice steady. But if they do, I won't be the same person they pushed around before. Chris's lips curled into a small smile. That's the spirit, he said. He leaned back in his booth, finishing the last of his cold burger and wiping his hands with a napkin. You don't let fear win. That's how they keep control. But once you stop being afraid, they lose their power. The woman near the counter nodded, a small glimmer of hope in her eyes. Maybe this town's not so small after all, she murmured. Jessica looked around, her heart still racing from the aftermath of the fight. But as she took in the faces around her, something in her shifted again. She had never thought of the diner as anything more than a job, something to get her by. But now it felt different. This wasn't just a place she worked. This was her community, and it had her back. The door jingled again, and this time, it wasn't another customer. It was a police officer, one of the younger ones from earlier, stepping into the diner with a small piece of paper in his hand. He walked up to Jessica, his expression serious. Here's my card, he said, setting it on the counter. If you need anything, don't hesitate to call. We'll keep an extra patrol around here for a while, just in case those guys decide to make trouble. Jessica took the card, running her thumb over the printed number. It was a small gesture, but it meant more than she could say. For the first time in a long time, she didn't feel alone in this. She looked at Chris and smiled, her voice soft but genuine. Thanks, she said, for everything. Chris nodded, standing up from his booth. Anytime, he said, giving her a wink. Next time someone like Jake walks through that door, you already know what to do. Jessica laughed, the sound light and genuine. For the first time in ages, she didn't feel trapped by fear. Yeah, Ido. Chris walked to the door, pushing it open with a soft creak. He turned once more, meeting her eyes with a final, knowing glance. Take care of yourself, Jessica, he said with a nod. And with that, he stepped out into the night, leaving the diner behind. Jessica stood there, the weight of everything that had happened finally sinking in. The wreckage, the fear, the chaos. It had all happened, but now, in the quiet aftermath, she felt a sense of peace. For the first time in a long time, she didn't feel afraid of what was next. She was ready to face it head on. The diner was still standing, and so was she.
If you enjoyed this story, we'd love for you to give it a like and subscribe to our channel. Your support means the world to us and motivates us to continue sharing heartwarming, inspiring stories almost every day.